Greetings, you two. At the time of recording, I'm reading a book that deals with the Palestinian era, Palestine in the first century CE rather, current era. And I learned something that I had no clue about. Now, admittedly, my knowledge of the history of Judaism is somewhat scant, um, but I didn't know that, at least in the first century, I don't know if that still holds true today, stone was considered the only appropriate material to make eating vessels from, cups and bowls. And the idea being is that God made stone, and vessels made from glass or ceramic or metal, since they were man-made, they had altered the materials that God had provided, were profane. And that was fascinating. Now, I don't know if anyone in the Jewish community still follows that guideline. Maybe the Hasidic Jews do. I'm not positive. If anyone out there is Jewish could tell me that, that would be cool. But it got me thinking that that would be completely and utterly appropriate for the dwarven community. I mean, who else in a fantasy setting is more closely associated with the earth than dwarves, unless you're going full elemental? So I'm going to throw that into this video as a campaign idea. So within dwarven communities, at least amongst those who follow good and neutral gods, stone is considered the most sacred and acceptable form of eating vessel, with plates, bowls, or drinking vessels, a cup or a goblet, something like that. Now, the more relaxed or liberal would probably not consider that to be a big issue, so they're willing to accept other forms of materials for their eating vessels, but they still might use just stone vessels on holy days. And even the most religious person or irreligious person in the dwarven community would still probably have at least a ceremonial drinking cup or goblet in their home. And it would probably be a common gift to give to someone. And of course, they're going to range in quality and value depending on the dwarven family or person, and their ability to their class, their status, their economic power. The more wealthy will have very elaborate cups and plates and bowls with carvings and made from alabaster and jade and things like that, while the less expensive and the poorer would have things made from much more common materials, maybe as lowly as granite in some cases. Marble, things like that. And it would be considered insulting to not use the vessels provided to you when you went to someone's home, particularly on a high holy day, whatever holy days there are that are celebrated by the dwarves in that particular religion. Though I believe it would, again, I think it would probably span across the entire range of dwarven religions, so long as they were not evil. Now, interestingly, if someone was a follower of an evil god, there's nothing to stop them from using stone vessels to give themselves the impression that they're not a worshiper of an evil god. And especially if they were an evil god of deception, that would play right into that particular pantheon's or that particular god's sphere of influence. I think this is a fascinating idea, and I haven't really considered how it could be applied to other of the cultures out there. What other cultures, we'll stick to the non-human cultures, would have kind of elements like this in as a representation of echoes of the past or current behaviors and practices. What do the elves do? What do the gnomes do? What do the halflings do? Do some of the more exotic of the races, like the Thri-Kreen, do they have similar cultural traits and behaviors and customs, traditions that are seen as important to them, but maybe seen as slightly odd from the outside? Now, having stone vessels is probably not going to be seen as overly unusual, particularly seeing as dwarves. Dwarves may be very traditional. They may make their own as a representation of their personal connection to their gods. So it wouldn't be uncommon for a dwarf who has some kind of stoneworking skill to be making their own vessels. And if they have a lot of it, say if they have not just stoneworking, a high level of stonework. Maybe they have a sculpting in there that you can get into some really elaborate stuff. But even just a high level of stoneworking would be able to make a dwarf, or allow a dwarf to make very attractive um, uh, vessels, even if they had no carving on them. I'm kind of getting this image of, Japanese Roku kind of a vibe going on there. A certain rough aesthetic that is still visually captivating and draws you in. But of course, I am also a fan of Roku pottery, so that influences my opinion, I guess. But I have seen very simple pieces of art that weren't elaborate, that are still captivating and beautiful. And I can see that as being perfectly appropriate to a dwarven culture that is using stone vessels. So let's talk about cultural behaviors, traditions, and customs within the non-human races. And would you use this stone? Do you think it's appropriate to apply a real-world religious tradition to fantasy? No, I think it is, because let's face it, we have taken entire pantheons from the real world and put them in the fantasy settings. So I think it's perfectly appropriate. But there are maybe people out there who don't. And if you are Jewish and you feel that I have appropriated something, I'd like to hear from you about it. But I, at this point in time, do not see it as an issue. Because again, we've taken entire pantheons and used them in fantasy settings many, many times. It is not a new concept here. So let's talk about religious and cultural traditions of the non-humans. In this particular case, stone vessels.